So, after several years of Mystic Umbreon making the best team for each Pokemon game, I feel like it was only a matter of time before someone asked the question, what is the best Pokemon team overall? Given that thousands of Pokemon fans dedicate themselves to crafting the perfect team for the competitive scene, I can't imagine I'm the only person to ask this. However, competitive players operate with the full knowledge that the success of any team is highly dependent on the specifics of the current battle they're in, as well as the context of the broader metagame. There are just so many complex and nuanced factors that contribute to the dynamic of a Pokemon battle that forming the absolute best team for every possible situation is basically impossible. So for the purposes of this video, I'm going to strip away all of that nuance to just focus on type interactions. There aren't any field conditions, I'm not accounting for items or abilities that might change a Pokemon's weaknesses and resistances, like Dry Skin or Air Balloon, and to keep an even playing field, I'm going to assume that every Pokemon in this thought experiment has equal stats across the board. So, with all other things being equal, what is the best Pokemon team in theory? Well, the first thing I did was list out all the types that were the sole counter to another type. If you don't know what a counter is, it's basically a Pokemon that can reliably knock out its opponent regardless of whether or not it takes the first hit. This generally means that both its stats and typing factor into its advantage over certain targets, but since every Pokemon's stats are equal in this scenario, that makes typing much more important, which is why I chose types that served offensive and defensive roles simultaneously. So, for example, instead of using an Ice type and a Steel type to knock out and wall dragons, respectively, I would just use a Fairy type, since it can do both. Because choosing types this way allows you to condense roles, it also helps to free up a type slot for other useful types. However, there is an exception in that fighting needs to be paired with Ghost, Rock, or Steel, since there's no singular type that is both super effective and resistant to normal. But anyway, with this list of key types established, I tried to identify each of their weaknesses in order to check whether or not they were already covered by another type on the list, though since the fighting Pokemon's weaknesses depend on its second type, I just marked all of those with an asterisk. As you can see, most types are covered at least once, but 3 types, namely Fire, Flying, and Fairy, remain completely uncovered, so I repeated the process to find their counters, of which they had 2 each. Rock and Water for Fire, Rock and Electric for Flying, and Poison and Steel for Fairy. Like the other types, I marked their strengths with slashes and their weaknesses with zeros, since they shared at least one of each, while everything else that varied got an asterisk. So, for example, I marked Flying with a slash, since it's countered by both Rock and Electric. I gave Ground a 0 because both Rock and Electric are weak to it, and Fighting, Steel, Water, and Grass all got asterisks since only Rock is weak to those types. It's interesting to note that while Rock is able to counter both Fire and Flying, that doesn't necessarily make it better than Water and Electric, since it has more weaknesses that are harder to cover, which is why I wanted to keep those options available. But regardless of which types I actually choose to counter Fire, Flying, and Fairy, the important thing is that I can finally start pairing them off now that I have more than 6 to work with. Because several of the key types share weaknesses, my top priority was to determine which types could be used to neutralize those weaknesses. So, for example, Grass and Fairy are both weak to Poison, but Grass can only neutralize this weakness by pairing with Ghost, while Fairy can combine with Rock, Steel, Ghost, or Poison itself. This is because pairing Grass with Rock, Steel, or Poison would ruin its key advantages over Ground and Water, thus negating the entire point of using it. However, the fighting type member of the team is once again an outlier due to needing Ghost, Rock, or Steel to counter normal types. Of the 3, it's clear that Steel is its best match since it neutralizes all 3 of Fighting's weaknesses, but unfortunately, combining them also neutralizes Steel's key resistance to Fairy in the process. This leaves Poison as the only remaining counter to Fairy, which is important because that means at least 4 Pokemon will share a ground weakness. Obviously, this isn't ideal, in part because there just aren't enough types to neutralize this weakness. However, I realized that if I combined some of these types together, I could reduce the total number of ground-weak Pokemon from 4 to 3. It would mean giving one of these Pokemon a double weakness, but it would put less pressure on the rest of the team to cover them. The remaining type could then be paired with Flying, so it can be a switch into ground moves while also cutting the team's ground weaknesses from 3 to 2, unlike Bug, which would only neutralize the ground weakness. As for which of the ground weak types should be paired with Flying and which ones should be paired with each other, I have a complicated explanation, so bear with me. Firstly, by adding flying into the mix, a third ice weakness is also added to the team. Flying must neutralize this particular weakness because grass and ground cancel each other's key advantages, so they can't be paired together to reduce that weakness. Fire is available to pair with flying, but that also cuts into the number of ice-resistant Pokemon which the team needs two of. However, if you pair poison with electric rather than with rock, that forces you to use water as the primary counter to fire, which is conveniently also resistant to ice. So thankfully it all works out. But to help you keep track, that gives us a Fighting Steel Pokemon, a Fire Flying Pokemon, and a Poison Electric Pokemon, all because Rock's defensive typing makes it too much of a hassle to use. But now, with the complicated half of the team out of the way, I can finally move on to the slightly simpler side of the team, starting with Grass. So, in order to determine Grass's ideal match, I just looked through all the options that would neutralize at least one of its weaknesses, because all of them are shared with at least one other type. That meant there were a lot of options, but I ultimately chose to pair Grass with Fairy since it was the only key type on those lists, as well as the only one to show up more than once, other than Ghost. So in addition to being the team's dedicated counter to ground Pokemon, Grass Fairy helps to reduce the number of bug and poison weaknesses by neutralizing one and compounding the other. However, while it helps to alleviate the team's weakness to ground, adding a grass type onto a team that already has a steel Pokemon naturally means that not one, but two Pokemon will be needed to counter fire. This makes water and ground the go-to types for the last two team slots. However, because they need to occupy those two team slots separately, the types can't be combined together. Ground also lacks a fire resistance, but since fire is already paired with flying, water needs to remain separate from it, and rock is too difficult to fit on the team anyway. This conveniently leaves dragon as the de facto type to pair with ground. All of dragon's weaknesses are already covered, so that means water and dark are the only types left that need to be paired up, which actually works out for the most part. When I look at the whole team, every weakness is covered by a resistance, and every counter to my team has an equal number of counters in turn, except for Fairy. The team's only counter for Fairy types is the Poison Electric Pokemon, like I mentioned before, but the last two team members could both easily be switched into and then knocked out by opposing fairies. Technically, I do still have the Fire Flying Pokemon to resist the hit, and the Fighting Steel Pokemon to deal super effective damage. I'm just a little disappointed that I couldn't fit those roles onto one Pokemon since everything else fits together so well, but despite that minor disappointment, I am very happy that the rest of the team holds together as well as it does, especially since I still have at least one counter to Fairy. Coincidentally, there are already existing Pokemon with these type combinations, so if you want to test the effectiveness of this team composition, I'd be curious to hear how it goes. I imagine it won't be the best team in practice since I didn't account for things like role specialization, but the goal of this video was more to see if it was possible to cover the entire type chart while still maintaining a balanced team. I also just wanted to show my general thought process when it comes to team building, and while I obviously start with actual Pokemon rather than just generating type combinations, the logic is pretty much the same. I'm glad this video took like a shorter amount of time to write. It was only like, I don't know, maybe 1.5 months, but I wasn't really focusing because I was like, in school. I actually had this idea months ago, but I didn't write down my reasoning, so when I revisited this idea, I had to retrace my steps and be like, shit, why did I do that? But if you can think of any other ways to do this, I hope you can articulate your methodology in the comments, but otherwise, that's all I have for now. Bye!